Today, our book that we are discussing is Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. And this book is set in Oklahoma up on the Kansas border. I need a huge map, but you can look at this, just cast your gaze at this map, and you can see that the Osage territory, Osage country, Osage County in Oklahoma is right up here on the Kansas border. It's not, as I looked at the map, probably the largest big town is Bartlesville, Oklahoma. And how many of you have lived in Oklahoma, born in Oklahoma? I know Mike was born in Oklahoma. You can,
Visited.
all right, visited, correct. Well, there's lots to be known about Oklahoma and lots that I don't know, so feel free to bring in your comments. The Osage people, Mike, the Osage people were at one point in U.S. history the wealthiest people and the most murdered people. This became a great scandal, a great tragedy, a great stain on American history and on our country. And it's well for us to know about it. Now, any of you remember the Lucky Strike radio program? Bert, do you? Are you?
Yes, I do.
And then later, the FBI story. I think that finally came out on television. And one of the things that I learned is J. Edgar Hoover, as all of these murders were taking place, sought to consolidate and build the power of the Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't the Federal Bureau of Investigation at that point. So he sent a special officer to Oklahoma, a big, great cowboy named Tom White, to investigate. But as the investigation rolled along, he had this story put on the Lucky Strike Hour so people would know all about the FBI. It became the FBI then. And then on to the FBI story, and I'm just telling you this now so I don't forget to say it. So some of the Osage people in this story say that later in the 50s, the whole family would gather around the television to watch the FBI story when that saga of the Osage came up, and they would all sit there and cry. So, Sunday's paper, for those of you who read real newspapers, like Bert and me, Sunday's paper had a wonderful editorial by Sister Denise LaRocque, who is a daughter of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. She is part of the Interfaith Welcome Coalition, whom the First Presbyterian Church hosts monthly. Thank you for your graciousness and kindness. And in her column, Sunday, Sister Denise says, "Resolve to open your eyes again to prejudice against minorities." And David Grann's fabulous book opens our eyes with no fake news, but real news and corroboration to the prejudice against minorities. David Grann brings out a meticulously researched and documented story of one part of our history of inequality, bias, and discrimination that continues today. What is Killers of the Flower Moon about, and how does Grann tell his story? Now here's the whole title: Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. He tells this story as a great detective story. I've heard so many people say, I love history when it's told as a story. Definitely that's what David Grann does, but he brings in documentation that just blows your mind. It's so well presented. In 1897, oil was discovered in Osage County, a reserve known as the Continental Shelf. You know, we have the Eagle Ford Shale here. Wish we had more of it. This vast oil reserve, also called the Underground Reservation, left the Osage people open for exploitation in order to take advantage of their wealth. Thus began what came to be known as the, quote, Osage Reign of Terror. After the discovery of oil, by 1907, the federal government allocated 657 acres of land per Osage. And you all, I don't know if I am pronouncing the word Osage correctly. Maybe you Oklahomans might know what the preferred pronunciation is. The 1907 gave head rights to each Osage. And how are you defined as an Osage, Native American, and Indian? You were on the tribal roll. If you were on the tribal roll in 1907, that meant that you, even if you were 8 years old, had this allotment of land and you were wealthy. The head rights could be inherited, though, by anyone who was a family member, by marriage, or by blood. And let me say again, by marriage. And thus began a rush of unscrupulous people going into the Osage county and marrying Osage women. But you know what my mother would say, trashy people of both sexes went in to that country to marry an Osage, a person of the Osage tribe, to get the money. Then what happened in 1921, the government decided that the Osage could not control their own money, so they needed a guardian. And guess what? The guardians were all white people. And, of course, we also find out that the guardians were not people you and I would want to have as our guardians. Let's put it that way. How wealthy were the Osage? In 1923, the Osage took in $30 million into this small area, a rough equivalent of $400 million. Blows your mind. One critic of Killers of the Flower Moon describes the book as a masterpiece of narrative nonfiction, but more than that, it is a searing indictment of the callousness and prejudice toward American Indians that allowed the killers, the murderers, to operate with impunity so long. So listen, everybody, to the opening paragraphs of Killers of the Flower Moon. In April, millions of tiny flowers spread over the Blackjack Hills and vast prairies in the Osage territory of Oklahoma. There are Johnny Jump-Ups and Spring Beauties and Little Bluets. the Osage writer John Joseph Matthews, and Grann quotes Matthews frequently in this book, observed that the galaxy of petals makes it look as if the gods had left confetti. The flowers begin to break down, though, and their petals flutter away, and before long they are buried underground. This is why the Osage Indians refer to May as the time of the flower-killing moon. And now Grann transitions to his story. On May 24th, 1921, Molly Burkhart, a resident of the Osage settlement town of Grayhorse, Oklahoma, began to fear that something had happened to one of her three sisters, Anna Brown. Another of Molly's sisters had already died, and now her second sister is sick. Like their parents, Molly and her sisters had their names inscribed on the Osage roll, which meant they were among the registered members of the tribe. It also meant that they possessed a fortune. Here's a hint, everybody. Molly's husband, Ernest Burkhart, when interviewed by the police, said, "I don't work. I'm married to an Osage." So does that give you a hint on who the murderers are of this particular group of people? Part one of Grann's book is entitled The Marked Woman, and Molly Burkhart is a marked woman. Her husband's uncle, a man named Hale, a prosperous rancher who was always dressed in a suit and often carrying a Bible. Don't you love that? This guy, Mr. Hale, had his nephew marry Molly Burkhart. And one sister had already died. Molly's worried about her second sister. Her second sister is found dead. Then Lizzie's mother dies. And then Molly is the surviving owner of all of these head rights. And who is she married to? Ernest Burkhart, and Mr. Hale is his uncle. So this shows the development of this story. A second part of the book, the second chronicle, is called The Evidence Man. Chronicle 2, Story 2, brings in the hero of our story, and this is a federal agent, a former Texas Ranger named Tom White. And Tom White was a tall, I'd say, good-looking cowboy. In fact, that's why J. Edgar Hoover did not really like Tom White all that much, because Hoover in the 1920s, as he's building the FBI, wants to create an FBI that is full of college-educated, suit-wearing young men. And old Mr. White, the cowboy, and his brothers too, I will say, does not fit Hoover's modern image. But what Mr. White has is a supreme dedication to carrying out the laws of the United States. So the evidence man comes into the Osage country, Mr. White, with his undercover agents. And the undercover agents are all some kind of cowboy, all but one, a man named Grann, who is an Indian medicine man, not of the Osage tribe, but of another group. And his undercover agents undercover and bring out evidence based on evidence, particularly when they begin to go to the penitentiaries and interview the, quote, outlaws of the Osage country. I think that Prohibition had also brought all these criminals into the Osage territory, right? So they could manufacture their moonshine. So that's why a lot of another big criminal element was there. What White finds out after all his research and evidence, that Ernest Burkhart's uncle, Mr. Hale, is the one manipulating all these murders. And what David Grann finds out in all of his research is that over 60 Osage people were murdered in this time span, all to get their royalties. Chronicle 3. Well, let me just say this to you all. The reward that Tom White receives from Hoover is that Mr. White becomes the warden of the Leavenworth Federal Prison. And it's very dramatic. One afternoon, Mr. White leaves the warden's office and he walks to the gates of the prison and he welcomes, shakes the hand of Hale, this heinous murderer, and Ramsey, a man who actually carried out the murders of the Osage people. That was a fitting conclusion. Chronicle 3, part 3 of the book is entitled The Reporter. And The Reporter, this section is actually about David Grann continuing to research this crime, this tragedy against the Osage people. He describes himself, everybody, at the Western National Archives in Fort Worth, where all the papers of the Osage people are, the documents from all the court trials. He says, and this is, again, amazing, but I believe it, of course, 100,000 cubic feet of information, of papers. So old David, he's a man with a mission. He combs through all of this information looking for more evidence about the Osage. He also, though, goes back to Oklahoma and interviews people whose grandfathers, aunts, uncles were killed. Now, there were 2 white people whom Hale put to death. You know, he didn't exactly do it himself, but he ordered it. One man is named Vaughn, and Lawyer Vaughn was known among the Osage as an honest person, and he was very sympathetic to their cause. He also had 10 kids, by the way. On the way back from Oklahoma City, Lawyer Vaughn was thrown off the train and murdered. His wife was left with nothing and 10 children. The Osage people took in some of the children, helped raise them, gave her as much money as they could. Another man murdered during this 1920s is a banker in Oklahoma City, McBride. McBride was also sympathetic to the Osage. His body was found. So what Grann finds out is, as I say, Hale was behind this, but also a banker named Burt, not Burt Clayton Burt, but this is Burt, B-U-R-T, the main banker in Pawhuskee, Oklahoma, which was, I guess, the larger town around these little villages. That man was also, doing horrible things. Bert was to get their money. At the end of the book, everyone, Grann goes to see a woman named named Webb. And Mrs. Webb tells him about the death of her grandmother. And her grandmother was one of the many people who was poisoned. And Grann says, the author says to Ms. Webb, well, what doctor did your grandmother go to? Oh, she was a patient of the Shawn brothers. And the Shawn brothers were two doctors in that Osage County who routinely helped poison the Osage so that their head rights could be taken. At the conclusion of the book, the last sentences of the book, Mrs. Webb quotes from the Bible. Grann and Mrs. Webb look out at the dusk, and she repeats what God told Cain after he killed Abel. The blood cries out from the ground. That's the last sentence of Grann's book. Now, I will say that I haven't talked to Sister Denise, who wrote the editorial this past Sunday, about opening our eyes to the prejudice against minorities. But this book, in a wonderfully written style, and I haven't spent enough time on Grann's style, but I think this book certainly opens our eyes. So thank you, everybody, for your attention. And let me ask you, those of you, I know some of you have read the book, those of you who haven't, what are your comments? What are your questions? Not that I can answer every one. But I want to say his documentation is not boring. You know, you're not sitting there saying, oh my gosh, please, no. He tells the story in such a clear, conversational style. So I hope you'll read the book if you haven't. And we were just talking about rereading it. Rereading it was a pleasure too.
It's a compelling read.
It is a compelling read, indeed. That's a great way to say it. Yes?
It sounds like there were a number of culprits.
Yes.
And it appears doubtful that all of them were able to be brought to justice.
Absolutely.
And so it also seems likely that there are a lot of people alive today who are heirs of ill-gotten gains.
Absolutely.
And making this whole thing a rather touchy thing. I have a deceased uncle, one of my mother's brothers, was a long-term resident of Enid, Oklahoma, which is not far away from where you're describing. And I never heard anything whatsoever about this, from
Absolutely.
my Uncle Jim, and he's bound to have,
You know they knew about it.
Is the money still coming in?
No. Production is down. I mean, what? I couldn't believe it. I don't understand this, but Grann is saying that it's like $3 a barrel or something like that. No, it isn't. They're not wealthy anymore. I mean, they're on welfare. Yes.
I was interested in this. I went with our church. The youth did a mission trip to Pahuska, Oklahoma.
Oh, fantastic.
I
Yeah.
went as a chaperone. They don't call it chaperones or whatever.
Well, we know what it is.
But
We've
we
been
went
there.
to Pahuska, and we stayed there, and you can tell it was once an amazing town. I mean, the structure, very, very, very poor now. But it's actually the home of Boy Scouts of America. They have a great museum, and if you go to Boy Scouts or Eagle Scouts. But you can tell in its time it was a very wealthy town. Now, I don't know how many of you follow Ree Drummond, who was the pioneer woman. She's the
You're right. I saw that online.
She's a cooking guru, has cookbooks and has shows. She lives right outside Pawhuska. I'm assuming her family has something to do with the Osage. I don't know that. But she's kind of turning Pawhuska around, and she's created a beautiful restaurant on the corner. It was in the process of being done when we were there in 2015, but a friend of mine who just moved from Bartlesville, she said, there's people that come, like they go to Waco to see Chip and Joanna Gaines' place. People are taking pilgrimages. So maybe there's hope that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, did you all go to the Osage Museum?
Absolutely.
I'd like to do that.
It's an amazing place. It's beautiful, but it's very poor. It's very, very poor.
Yes, and very sad. And Grann, our author, interviews a woman named Red Corn, who is the librarian at the Osage Museum. And Ms. Red Corn brings out a family diary or journal about the murder of their great-great-great aunt. And as you were just saying, through research, he finally finds out that this woman was poisoned by these doctors, the Shauns, S-H-A-U-N. And what is it? I mean, these people were interviewed and actually confessed, but nothing happened to them. Yes.
I found the issue very troubling that a white man could kill an Osage, and it wasn't considered murder.
That's right.
It was considered cruelty to animals.
Right. I'm glad you quoted that. That's one of the quotes in the book. Cruelty to animals. Very troubling. But the whole story, again, is told in such a way that you believe it. It's perfect, really. It's a great book. Other comments, you all?
I just wanted to say, I have not done this. I'm wondering if anyone else has, how this story was not brought up before or made known before this. And I'm curious how the author
Well,
decided to do the research and look into it.
Well, I would say certainly the times that we live in with the intense interest in slavery, uncovering that history, I think that the zeitgeist, the times encourage that. But I've asked myself that question. What inspired David Grann to go directly to the Osage?
What was his connection? Yeah.
Yes, what is his connection, other than he just got obsessed with it? I mean, he is obsessed with it because he is so sad about what happened.
Is there still an Osage reservation? I'm trying to remember.
Yes. I don't know if it's called a reservation, but yes, the Osage people. I read there are 125,000 Osage people today. But of course, not all of them are living.
Well, don't you know that this Osage story is just one of many different
Exactly.
Indian tribes that in a couple of years there'll be another book of Navajo.
Sure.
This was the rituals.
Yeah.
This was the rituals.
Yeah.
Well, and that's one of the things that the tribal elders said. They left Kansas and went to this place in Oklahoma because they thought it was so poor that nobody would bother them. And then, of course, hey, we hit the continental shelf, and there it goes. Everybody also thought about Presbyterian missionaries, because I think the Presbyterian missionaries were very active among the Native American peoples in really good ways. But you all probably, you know more about that than I do, and I don't know. When you were with the youth in Pawhuska, what were y'all doing? I mean, what group were you working?
It's kind of like with a national organization called Youth Workers or something that our church connected up with, and they had 3 young ladies that were on staff with the American, it would be like a Young Life or something, and they were stationed there. And one of them, actually, I still follow on social media, and she has fallen in love with one of the Osage men there and is moved to Pasco. She's just grown to love the people there.
Well,
But we
fantastic.
did farming and babysitting and we did all. Kids divide up.
Well, that's wonderful.
It's more.
I hope he has a few of his head rights left. Thank you, everybody. Such a pleasure.